In the cold chambers beneath Nuremberg's fortress, the Iron Maiden stood tall, its wooden frame plated with iron and filled with hidden spikes. To the townsfolk, it was not merely a device, was a warning. Whispered tales said her embrace was colder than the grave, and none who entered ever returned whole. Accused heretics and thieves alike were sentenced to her cruel clasp. The condemned would be pushed inside, the door shutting with a groan as iron fangs pierced flesh, but not enough to kill swiftly. Instead, the victim bled slowly, screams muffled by the maiden's hollow chest. Crowds gathered not to see the moment of death, but to hear the echo of suffering. For days, guards reported muffled cries within, a haunting reminder that justice was not swift but agonizing. Parents led their children past the chamber to teach obedience through fear. Though some historians later doubted her actual use, in medieval minds, the Iron Maiden was terrifyingly real. She was not just a device, she was a symbol of power, control, and the Church's unyielding grip over body and soul. Even in silence, she killed. The dungeon smelled of sweat, iron, and hopelessness. At its center lay the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, waiting like a beast for its prey. Chains rattled as the prisoner was bound, wrists pulled one way, ankles the other. The torturer, calm as a priest at mass, turned the handles. With each crank, the man's body stretched, sinews snapping, bones creaking under impossible strain. His screams rose above the torchlight, echoing through the stone corridors. The purpose was rarely execution. The rack was designed to break more than bones. It shattered loyalty, extracted confessions, and made heretics speak the words their captors demanded. False or true, it mattered little. Once the body was ruined, the soul was considered conquered. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of its power. To them, it was the devil's own machine. They feared that even truth could not save a man from its merciless pull. When dawn came, the broken body was often paraded in the square, a living sermon against defiance. Few devices instilled such universal terror. The rack stretched not only flesh, but the very spirit of medieval justice, cruel, unyielding, and unforgettable. The Judas Cradle stood in the shadows of medieval dungeons, its triangular seat gleaming like a cruel altar. Prisoners accused of heresy or blasphemy were stripped bare and lowered slowly upon its sharp point. The design was simple, yet its agony was unmatched. The victim's weight determined the torment. The more they struggled, the deeper the seat pressed into their flesh. Guards tied ropes to their ankles and weighted them down, prolonging suffering for hours, sometimes days. Infection was common, death inevitable. The cradle was not only about pain, it was about shame. Public executions often used it as a spectacle. The condemned sat exposed, humiliated, their cries echoing through the square. While the crowd whispered of divine punishment, parents brought children to witness, warning them that sin led to such disgrace. The Church called it purification, yet in truth it was nothing more than cruelty cloaked in faith. Though centuries have passed, the Judas Cradle still lingers in nightmares. It was never just wood and iron, it was humiliation sharpened into a weapon, turning punishment into theatre and shame into a slow death. Unlike the rack, which pulled bodies apart, the scavenger's daughter did the opposite. It crushed. Designed by Sir Leonard Skivington, a lieutenant of the Tower of London, the iron frame folded its victims into a position of unbearable pain. Kneeling, the prisoner's hands and feet were bound close to the body. The device then compressed them until ribs cracked, blood vessels burst, and breath came only in desperate gasps. Victims often bled from ears, nose, and mouth, their bodies reduced to trembling husks. Unlike fiery executions meant for the public, the daughter's cruelty was hidden in dungeon shadows. Its purpose was confession, not spectacle. Many prisoners confessed not from guilt, but from the sheer need to end the suffocating agony. Whispers in London called it the Iron Womb, mocking its name. It was said the daughter embraced with a mother's grip, yet her embrace left nothing but broken bones and silence. For those who entered her steel frame, there was no escape, only the crushing weight of medieval justice. The heretic's fork was deceptively small, a metal rod with sharp prongs at both ends strapped between chin and chest. Its cruelty lay not in tearing flesh, but in forbidding speech. Victims were forced to wear it during trials or interrogations. Any attempt to speak, pray, or plead drove the prongs into flesh, piercing tongue and throat. Silence was the only escape. Even swallowing caused pain, turning the act of living into torment. Often used by the Inquisition, the fork ensured obedience. A priest would inscribe "I renounce" on the device, a constant reminder of the condemned's supposed sins. The prisoner stood immobilized, drooling blood, eyes wide with terror as the crowd looked on. It was not designed to kill, but to humiliate. The condemned could endure hours or days, starving slowly while forbidden even the mercy of words. Medieval minds feared it as a device of the devil himself. Yet the Church wielded it as a holy tool, silencing the tongues of blasphemers, while parading their suffering as divine justice. The fork was proof that silence could scream louder than words. In dark castles across Europe, the chair of nails waited like a throne of terror. Its iron frame bristled with hundreds of spikes on the seat, the arms, even the backrest. Once strapped in, escape was impossible. Victims were seated naked, their weight pressing flesh into the spikes. Every movement, every breath drove the nails deeper. Sometimes the torturer would heat the chair, turning pain into fire. Blood soaked the floor, the scent of scorched flesh lingering in the chamber long after the victim was gone. Unlike hidden tortures, the chair was often displayed in public halls. It was meant to terrify, to show that kings and inquisitors ruled not only with swords, but with suffering. Accused traitors, witches, or spies endured its embrace. while the crowd jeered, watching as rulers made examples of them. Some survived hours of agony, forced to confess false crimes just to be released. Others died seated, becoming grotesque statues of blood and iron. The chair was not just a device. It was a throne of despair-granting, no power, only torment, until death gave the only release. Small, sinister, and deceptively simple. The pear of anguish was a device shaped like fruitiette. Its purpose was monstrous. Made of iron, it was inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or even womb. A screw mechanism forced its petals to expand, tearing flesh from within. For blasphemers, the pear was placed in the mouth to silence their heresies. For thieves, it was used in unspeakable ways to humiliate as much as to punish. For women accused of witchcraft or adultery, its cruelty was doubled, both a tool of torture and a symbol of sexual shame. Victims often died from internal bleeding, though death was not always immediate. The pear was designed to punish, to desecrate, and to instill fear that sin would be met with unimaginable agony. Its size made it portable, a weapon of terror that inquisitors carried like a holy relic. People whispered that just the sight of it could make even the most defiant prisoner confess. The pear was proof that medieval justice reached inside the body itself, turning shame into torment, and torment into a final silence. A device forged with malice, the breast ripper was used primarily against women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or heresy. Iron claws, curved like talons, were heated red-hot before being clamped onto bare flesh. The sentence was brutal, yet symbolic. Punishment aimed not at survival, but at disfigurement. The victims' screams filled the chamber as flesh was torn, their body forever marked as a warning to others. If they lived, they carried scars that branded them as sinners in the eyes of their community. The breast ripper was most often employed in public, where the humiliation equaled the pain. Men and women alike watched as justice was carried out, reinforcing obedience through spectacle. For women, it was a cruel reminder that their very bodies could be weaponized against them. Its horror lingered not just in the tearing of flesh, but in the way it transformed victims into living sermons of shame. In medieval minds, sin was written upon the body, and the breast ripper was the pen. At first glance, the thumbscrew seemed almost harmless. A small wooden or metal vise designed to crush fingers or toes. Yet in practice, its cruelty was limitless. The victim's digits were placed between its iron jaws, and the screw was tightened slowly. With each twist, bones cracked, nails split, and flesh turned to pulp. The screams were piercing, for the agony concentrated on such small parts of the body became unbearable. The thumbscrew was not meant for execution, but for confession. It was a torturer's tool of patience applied in escalating stages until truth, falsehood, or madness spilled from the victim's lips. Many emerged from its grip with hands mangled beyond use. In an age where labor meant survival, such mutilation condemned them to poverty as surely as the torture condemned them to pain. Its small size made it portable, favored by inquisitors and guards alike. Unlike grand devices, it needed no dungeon-only cruelty and time. The thumbscrew was proof that terror did not always come from towering machines. Sometimes it came from the smallest device, capable of crushing not just bones, but spirits. The boot was a torture device of wood and iron, simple yet devastating. The prisoner's leg was placed inside a rigid casing, and wedges were hammered between the boot and the flesh. Each blow splintered bone, driving agony up through the body. The victim's screams rose with every strike. Flesh tore, marrow bled, and the leg became little more than shattered fragments. Some were left permanently crippled, others never survived the blood loss. In Scotland and France, it became infamous as a method to break political prisoners, forcing them to betray allies or confess to imagined crimes. Unlike quick execution, the boot prolonged suffering, ensuring obedience through sheer terror. Public knowledge of the device spread fear across villages. To defy authority was to risk not just death, but dismemberment. Mothers warned their children of the boot as if it were a monster waiting to crush the disobedient. It stood as a symbol of medieval cruelty. Punishment not to end life, but to ruin it beyond repair. The garrote was a deceptively simple device. A wooden post with an iron collar attached by a screw or lever. The condemned was seated, neck secured, and the screw tightened until bones cracked and breath ceased. Unlike many medieval tortures, the garrote was often used as an execution method rather than interrogation, yet it carried its own unique terror. Victims felt the slow tightening bones snapping, veins bursting as. The crowd looked on. Death came not swiftly, but in suffocating waves. In Spain, the garrote became infamous during the Inquisition. Heretics and rebels alike were silenced beneath its collar, their deaths framed as mercy compared to burning. But the sight of a man strangled into silence haunted onlookers long after the body was taken away. The device symbolized control, stripping victims of voice, breath, and dignity. Unlike fire or blade, it left no grand spectacle, only silence and shadows. For many, that silence was the most chilling punishment of all. Unlike devices hidden in dungeons, the pillory stood proudly in town squares, a wooden frame locking victims by the neck and wrists. It was less about pain and more about shame. The condemned stood immobilized, forced to face their community. Crowds gathered to jeer, throw rotten food, and hurl stones. For hours or even days, the victim endured humiliation that often cut deeper than physical wounds. Though some fainted from sun and hunger, others were beaten by mobs until they collapsed. For thieves, blasphemers, and debtors, the pillory was not just punishment, it was erasure of dignity. Children mocked, merchants spat, priests preached sermons over the trembling figure. Even after release, the memory of public shame lingered, branding the victim long after the wood was removed. The pillory was a stage where justice turned into theatre. It taught communities obedience through the destruction of reputation, ensuring that fear of ridicule kept many in line. Similar to the pillory, the stocks trapped victims by the ankles, forcing them to sit exposed in the open square. While seemingly less cruel, the punishment carried its own brand of torment. For days, prisoners sat in awkward positions, unable to stand, stretch, or shield themselves. The crowd hurled insults, waste, and stones. The humiliation was public, the suffering prolonged. Some froze in winter winds, others collapsed from dehydration under the sun. Unlike grand executions, the stocks were a punishment for common crimes, petty theft, drunkenness, or gossiping. Yet the scars they left on one's reputation were lasting. Neighbors who once shared bread now saw only shame. The device required no iron spikes or flames. Its cruelty came from community itself. The stocks revealed how medieval justice often turned neighbors into executioners, not with swords, but with ridicule. The ducking stool was a chair mounted on a long wooden beam, used to punish women accused of gossip, witchcraft, or rebellion. The victim was strapped in and repeatedly plunged into rivers or ponds. The punishment carried a deadly paradox. If the woman drowned, she was declared innocent but dead. If she survived, she was branded guilty, spared only to face further torture. Crowds gathered to watch as the chair swung over the water, jeering at the sputtering victim as she gasped for air. For supposed witches, the ducking stool became proof of guilt, no matter the outcome. For gossiping wives, it was humiliation made spectacle. Drenched and shivering, many did not survive the ordeal. Those who did often carried lung damage or broken spirits. It was justice not rooted in truth, but in fear and control, turning rivers into courts and water into a tool of shame. A symbol of both punishment and permanence. The branding iron marked criminals as outcasts for life. Heated until glowing, it was pressed against flesh-searing letters or symbols into skin. Thieves bore T, blasphemers B, and deserters D. Each scar told the world of their crime, ensuring punishment extended long after the pain faded. Public branding was a spectacle. The hiss of burning flesh, the scream of the condemned, the smell of charred skin all seared into memory as much as flesh. Crowds learned that sin was not only punished but inscribed upon the body itself. Unlike chains or prisons, the brand could not be removed. It turned skin into a lifelong sentence, stripping victims of anonymity and condemning them to constant suspicion. The branding iron was less about justice and more about control, ensuring that even beyond the square, society carried out the punishment through fear and rejection. In the heart of towns, the whipping post stood as a grim reminder of law. Prisoners were tied to its wooden frame, backs exposed, as executioners lashed them with whips, rods, or cat-o'-nine-tails. Each strike tore flesh, drawing blood that stained the ground. The crowd watched in silence or, sometimes in cruel delight as the condemned screamed under the blows. The pain was temporary, but the scars lasted a lifetime. The whipping post was not just a device, but a stage for humiliation. Neighbors, friends, even family were forced to witness, ensuring the shame ran deeper than the lashes. Some were whipped until unconscious, their bodies limp against the post. Others survived, but carried the welts as eternal reminders of their disgrace. It was one of the simplest punishments, yet one of the most feared, for it transformed public squares into theatres of blood, where pain was justice and shame was law. Known also as the breaking wheel, this device was the epitome of medieval cruelty. Victims were bound to a large wooden wheel, limbs stretched across its spokes. With heavy iron clubs, executioners shattered arms and legs, bone by bone. The condemned did not die quickly. Broken bodies were left upon the wheel, displayed to the public as carrion for birds. Sometimes victims lingered for days, begging for death while crowds passed below. For traitors and murderers, the wheel was considered fitting justice, a slow, visible destruction of body and spirit. Its purpose was not only execution, but warning, reminding all who saw that rebellion led only to ruin. Few images haunted medieval imagination more than the sight of a body twisted unnaturally across a wheel. Bones jutting through skin, cries fading into silence. It was cruelty elevated into spectacular theatre of death that branded itself into history. Unlike other instruments of torture, the executioner's sword was meant to be merciful. A single, clean stroke to the neck promised swift death if the blade was sharp and the executioner skilled. Yet, even in mercy, terror lingered. Condemned prisoners knelt before the crowd, eyes fixed on the shining blade. The moment of silence before the swing was agony enough. For some, the stroke was clumsy, requiring multiple blows. Blood sprayed, the crowd gasped, and mercy turned to horror. The sword symbolized both justice and theatre. Nobles often received this honor, their deaths swifter than peasants burned or broken. To die by sword was a privilege of rank, yet still a grim reminder of authority's reach. In the minds of medieval people, the executioner's blade was double-edged, both feared and respected, both merciful and cruel. With every swing, it cut not just flesh, but the memory of defiance. The spiked collar was a device of penance, forcing the wearer into pain with every movement. Iron bands studded with sharp points encircled the neck, digging into flesh if the victim dared to tilt their head or rest. Prisoners wore it for days, sometimes weeks, enduring wounds that festered and bled. Eating, sleeping, even breathing became torment. The Church called it a punishment for pride, forcing the condemned to bow in agony. In villages, sinners were paraded in collars, heads dripping blood, as sermons rang out against their sins. Children pointed, crowds mocked, and every step deepened the humiliation. It was not a device of execution, but of slow suffering, blending shame with pain. The scars it left were more than physical, they were reminders etched into both flesh and soul. Shackles were among the simplest yet most cruel tools of imprisonment. Heavy iron cuffs bound ankles and wrists, chaining prisoners in darkness. With no freedom to move, bodies stiffened, wounds festered, and spirits withered. Some shackles were spiked, cutting into skin with every twitch. Others were weighted so heavily that standing became impossible. Days blurred into nights in the dungeon, chains rattling like ghosts in the silence. Unlike executions, shackles offered no final release. They condemned victims to slow decay, starving in filth until disease or despair claimed them. For villagers who glimpsed prisoners in chains, the sight was terrifying. Not just men punished, but men reduced to shadows of themselves. Shackles were more than restraints. They were symbols of hopelessness, reminders that freedom itself could be torn away, used to punish women accused of gossip, scolding, or rebellion. The cucking stool was less about pain than humiliation. The condemned was strapped into a chair and paraded through town, mocked and jeered by crowds. Unlike the ducking stool, which plunged victims into water, the cucking stool left them exposed on land. Women were wheeled past markets and taverns, their reputations destroyed before neighbors and kin. Though not always lethal, the punishment scarred reputations beyond repair. A woman once seated in the cucking stool could never reclaim her honor. Husbands abandoned wives, children hid in shame, and the gossip that once filled her mouth became the weapon of her undoing. It was cruelty without blood, a punishment aimed at the soul rather than the body. Forged from heavy iron, the mask was clamped over the victim's face, muffling their cries and hiding their identity. Some were plain, while others were grotesquely shaped, mocking the condemned as animals or demons. Breathing was stifled, vision darkened, and speech silenced. Victims endured days beneath the suffocating weight, sweat and blood pooling beneath the metal. For the public, the iron mask was a symbol of control. It silenced rebellion, erased individuality, and turned men into faceless shadows. Those forced to wear it became walking warnings, stripped of humanity and reduced to silent suffering. The mask was not always fatal, but it was always humiliating. It suffocated slowly not the body, but the soul. The Cotonine tails was a whip divided into multiple knotted strands, often tipped with iron or bone. Each strike tore skin into ribbons, drawing blood with ease. When heated over flames, the whip became a weapon of fire. Flesh burned and blistered with every lash, leaving scars that never healed. Victims often collapsed in shock, their backs flayed raw, their screams echoing through the night. The Cato Ninetails was used both at sea and on land, punishing sailors, soldiers, and criminals alike. Its cruelty was universal. The whip knew no mercy, no pause, no forgiveness. It was said that 10 lashes could cripple a man, 20 could kill him. Yet the true purpose was not always death, it was to leave survivors branded in agony, living proof of obedience. At first glance, the wooden horse looked like a child's toy, simple beam shaped like a sharp triangle. But when victims were forced to straddle it, naked, with weights tied to their ankles, the truth was revealed. The body pressed down upon the sharp edge, cutting into flesh with every shift. Blood soaked the wood, and the pain grew unbearable. For hours, sometimes days, victims endured humiliation as much as torment, their suffering made public for all to see. The wooden horse was a punishment for soldiers, traitors, and sometimes women accused of immorality. It was not always lethal, but survivors bore scars in both flesh and memory. It was cruelty disguised as simplicity, proving that even wood could become a weapon of fear. The scold's bridle, or brank, was an iron cage placed over the head, fitted with a metal bit that pressed into the mouth. It prevented speech, cutting the tongue if the victim tried to speak. Often used against women accused of gossip or rebellion, it silenced voices through pain and humiliation. Victims were paraded through towns, their mouths bleeding, while the crowd mocked it. The bridle was not only about silence, it was about control. It reminded women that their words could be punished, their voices caged like beasts. To wear the bridle was to endure both physical agony and social ruin, as neighbors laughed at the grotesque mask. Long after the device was removed, the shame remained. Known in some places as Spanish boots, these devices encased legs in iron or wood. Wedges were driven between the casing and the flesh, splintering bones and shredding muscle. Sometimes the boots were heated over flames, roasting the victim's legs inside the metal shell. The smell of burning flesh filled the dungeon as the condemned screamed. The device was used to extract confessions or punish rebels, leaving survivors crippled for life. In an age where strength meant survival, such maiming was as devastating as death itself. The iron boots were remembered not only for pain, but for the image of smouldering flesh, a reminder that cruelty could be both inventive and relentless. Flaying was among the most gruesome punishments of the medieval world. With razor-sharp knives, executioners peeled skin from the living layer by layer. Victims were often tied to posts in public squares, their screams filling the air as flesh was stripped from muscle. Death came slowly from shock, blood loss, or exposure, reserved for traitors and enemies of the state. Flaying was meant to erase not only life, but dignity. Bodies were displayed as warnings, skins sometimes nailed to city gates as grim trophies. It was cruelty at its most visceral, where pain was spectacle and death was theatre. Few punishments haunted the imagination as deeply as the knife that stole a man's very skin. Few punishments inspired greater dread than the cauldron. A massive iron pot was filled with water, oil, or even molten lead, heated over roaring flames. The condemned were either lowered into the bubbling liquid or had the cauldron placed upon their stomachs with fire stoked beneath. The screams were unlike any other. Flesh blistered and sloughed away, Bones cracked, and steam choked the air. Crowds often gathered to watch, both horrified and fascinated, as executioners stirred the flames to prolong the agony. In some kingdoms, the cauldron was punishment for poisoners boiled in the very substance they were accused of using. It was a justice steeped in symbolism, a death as slow and consuming as the crime. The sight of boiling flesh haunted all who witnessed it. Even the executioners, hardened by years of cruelty, confessed that the stench clung to their clothes and their dreams. The cauldron was not only execution, but spectacle turning punishment into theatre of fire and screams. The branding cage was a metal frame, fitted around the head or body, heated until it glowed. Victims were locked inside, flesh searing as the iron bit into skin. Unlike a single branding iron, the cage scarred large portions of the body, marking the condemned forever. Some cages bore the insignia of rulers or the church, branding victims as heretics or traitors. Others were grotesque, shaped like beasts or demons, mocking the victim as they burned. Crowds gathered to witness the branding, the smell of scorched flesh filling the air as the condemned writhed. When released, survivors bore scars too vast to conceal public marks of eternal shame. The cage was not always fatal, but its purpose was worse: to turn the body into a living confession, a walking symbol of guilt. Long after the flames faded, the scars spoke for the victim, ensuring they could never escape their punishment. The branding cage was cruelty perfected pain, humiliation, and permanence fused into one. Though more ancient than strictly medieval, the Brazen Bull haunted European imagination for centuries. A hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull, it contained a chamber for the victim inside. A fire was lit beneath, heating the metal until the prisoner roasted alive. Ingeniously cruel, the bull was designed with pipes that transformed screams into bellowing roars, echoing across the square. To spectators, it seemed as if the bull itself cried in fury, its voice fueled by human agony. Death was slow, flesh blistered, lungs burned, and the sound of metallic roars became a chorus of suffering. Executioners and rulers alike reveled in the theatre of it, claiming divine justice was at work. Though its use dwindled, tales of the Brazen Bull endured in medieval lore, whispered warnings of rulers who turned justice into spectacle. The bull stood as a symbol of power, cruelty forged into art, terror disguised as majesty. In its belly, humanity was silenced, leaving only the echoes of burning screams.